I've danced with the devil too many times to count. Got the scars to prove it. I used to feel something after pulling the trigger on a man or running a knife through his gut. That changed over time. You do anything enough times and it starts to feel natural, I guess. When I was a kid, I used to think I had it all figured out. I used to wonder why other people made things so needlessly complicated. I hadn't been through anything yet. I hadn't lost nothing. My spirit was still like a blooming cactus flower. No one had come along and plucked any of the petals yet. I remember hoping Wilson would get to the saloon soon. If I'd had a few more drinks, I'd have been worse off than the dust-covered geezers sitting at the piano. I got to wondering how old that town was. It felt kind of new when I pulled up on Winnie, but the longer I hung around, the more it felt like it had been there for decades. Maybe business didn't pick up and they had to stop building on it. Or maybe there was a drought. Hard telling. The saloon door slapped open and Wilson strolled in, hands on his irons. He strutted over and sat in true Wilson fashion. He got his whiskey and turned to me. "Your letter said you'd be meeting me in a saloon." I stared at him blankly and waited for the punchline. "This place looks like it ain't been swept since Custer was corporal. Bartender might as well rent the tumbleweeds out front as Mustangs at this point." Wilson tipped his whiskey back and motioned for the barkeep to pour another. The barkeep raised an eyebrow and looked at me. "Don't mind him, he's just a jackass with a smart mouth." Wilson pushed a coin across the table. Both of the eyebrows of the man went up as he saw its silver shimmer. He filled Wilson's glass to the brim. Wilson took a modest swig and continued. "You look like hell, Quarry." Although it was a backhanded remark, I felt an underpinning sense of concern in his voice. He turned to me, grabbed my shoulder, and smiled. Wilson lives for banter like that, so I figured I'd indulge him. "You look about half alive yourself." "You think I come all this way to be pulled through the mud?" Wilson replied after another sip from his glass. "You're about one of the only people I'd make this trip for anyway. If I wouldn't have known you since we were pups, I probably wouldn't have come, honestly. Plus, I wouldn't want the death bird showing up at my ranch to gun me down. You come up with that nickname, or is that something—" I cut him off with a stern kick to his stool. He clutched the side of it as it wobbled. "Whoa, cowboy, I don't ride bulls no more, so cut that off." He noticed the barkeep staring at me. I looked at Wilson and nodded to the back of the saloon. As we took our new seats away from prying ears, Wilson continued. "I don't hear from you in a lifetime, then you send me a letter that says you've got something worthwhile to talk about, so spill it, Quarry." I already knew the answer to my question before I asked it, but I asked it anyway. "If the right job came along, would you ever think about getting back in?" Considering how hot-headed Wilson is, I half expected him to just up and walk out, but he didn't. He waited, swirling the whiskey in his half-empty glass as he thought. Then he pulled a half-smoked cigar from his vest and relit it. Through the haze of his long, exhaling breath, he answered my question. "I got out. I almost didn't, but by the grace of God or whatever else is up there, I did. I'm a family man now, and I got an honest ranch. Not gonna lie, it feels real nice playing the part again, coming out here to meet you. But I got kids now, Quarry. As good as the money was, I can't risk leaving them without a daddy, like I was left." It was quiet for a moment. Then the man at the piano started to gently tickle the out-of-tune keys. Wilson motioned for the barkeep to come to our table. He did, and Wilson tucked 2 silver coins into the man's apron pocket. The bottle was sitting on the table when he walked off. "I've been doing all right at the ranch anyway. No amount of money is going to pull me out of my business. Unless you found gold. You didn't find gold, did you son of a bitch?" The flower on Wilson's cactus had seen a lot by that point, but it was hardy and bright. I don't think a stampede could have withered its petals. I reached into my coat pocket and felt the coarse, pulpy paper. I unfolded the reason I had asked him to meet with me. Then I smoothed the wrinkles on the paper out a bit and slid it over to him. Wilson brushed the smoke away from his eyes as he pulled the paper up to his face. He squinted as he stared into the cold, black eyes of the man on the wanted poster. "Huh, why you been holding on to this relic?" I unfolded another and slid it to him. "It ain't a relic, Wilson. There's more." Wilson looked around, then leaned in. "Then they got it wrong, 'cause we killed that son of a bitch and threw him in the Walker River years ago. You're gonna call me out here into the middle of nowhere and try to convince me that there's a bounty on a dead man? Calm down, Wilson. There aren't a lot of people in here, but you know just as well as I do that one person is all it takes to get people talking about your doings, especially in a town like this. Wilson caught the attention of the barkeep and another man who had come in with his outburst. I jerked him back into his chair. It's him. I don't know how, but he's back. People have been seeing him and his men again, and I've been on his trail. Wilson breathed heavily as he took a big drink of his whiskey. Killing him won't bring Abigail back, he said as he leaned back in his chair. It won't change the past. None of the people you hunt down can do that. Trust me, Quarry. This trail's just a dead end. I don't know how he's back, and frankly, I don't give a damn. Quit while you can. There's more to life than being a bounty man. I lit my own cigar. Life's basically over for me, Wilson. I don't have much to live for, and I'm living on borrowed time. Oh, bullshit, he replied. May I continue? I snapped at him. Having Abigail was like looking through a window at a bright blue sky. When Silas killed her, I tapped the wanted poster in front of us. That sky clouded up, and that window got caked shut with dirt. I thought when we did him in that things would feel better. I guess they did for a time, but that didn't last. Eventually, none of the sick bastards I took down gave me that sense of peace. I felt like a goddamn addict trying to get that first high again. For the past year or two, I've been trying to find that sense of peace, satisfaction again. I think that... Wilson cut me off. You think that I'm going to help you satiate your bloodlust so you can get that rush again, right? I've ridden that horse, and it'll buck you off without giving two fucks. You ride that thing long enough, and you'll end up with a bullet in your belly or a knife in your back. He tipped his glass back and slammed it onto the table. I stared at him and took another drag from my cigar. He didn't get it. He didn't see the obvious snake coiled up about to bite him and his whole family. I tapped the paper again. I don't have nothing left to live for. You do. Wilson's eyes widened, and he jumped to his feet again. And you brought me all the way out here, away from my family, out here in the middle of goddamn nowhere. I gotta go back. I gotta... Sit, I yelled. That time I captured the attention of the saloon's 3 patrons and the barkeep. I waved a hand at the barkeep again, reassuring him that there was nothing to concern himself with. There was undoubtedly a loaded shotgun under his counter. Well, if he wasn't a fool of a barkeep, there was. Wilson sat, and I continued. I've been tracking him. He ain't anywhere near your family, at least not yet. I'm sure after some time he'll be wanting to get revenge from you and me both. But right now, he's planning something. You helped me kill him once, and I need you to help me kill him again. I won't have you losing your family to anyone, especially to the man who took Abigail. Wilson nodded. It was a nod I'd seen a handful of times years ago. He was too proud to say it out loud, but that nod told me he'd be coming along with me. Wilson took a sip of his drink and pinched the bridge of his nose. If I do this, he said, promise me this is your last one. He put his hand out, and I shook it. I pointed to his glass. As long as you promise me that's your last one. The next morning, Wilson felt the need to remind me about his hangover multiple times. Why'd you let me keep drinking like that, Quarry? I don't live that life no more, and you just sat back and watched the train go right off the tracks. Winnie snorted. Even she knew Wilson was full of shit. I ain't your babysitter. Just make sure you ration your water. We won't hit the next town till close to sundown. Wilson capped his canteen, slicked his hair back, and rolled his eyes. You sure you know where Silas is? 'Cause if you don't, I'm headed straight back to my family. I ain't risking that. Some things never change. Wilson would have trusted me with his life. He would have trusted me with his loved ones, but he would not have trusted me to know my middle name. I've been tracking him for a few weeks, I assured him. He's been headed west, leaving a trail of bodies in his wake. Sounds like Silas. Back when he was alive, well, the first time, he was one of the most ruthless bastards on God's green earth. I'm preaching to the choir, I know. I was just happy to see him dead and floating down the river by the end of it. Bounty be damned. Winnie snorted again. He's the lowest of scum, Wilson snapped. I wouldn't expect nothing less. What I don't get is how he came back. You saw it, I saw it. He should be deader than a dried-out rattlesnake. That's partly why we're headed where we're headed, I replied. The last lead I got told me to meet someone in Copper Run who knows a thing or two about Silas. Her name's Matena. I watched as Wilson spat, then flipped his saddlebag open to retrieve a small bottle of whiskey. I hate doing it, but a little hair of the dog might cure what ails me. He took a swig and returned the bottle to his bag. How do you know we ain't walking right into a trap? Maybe your informant works for Silas, or maybe he wants to throw you off his trail. That might all be true, but considering the state of the man's town and the loss of his daughter, I highly doubt it. According to him, it wasn't just Silas that came through their town. A pack of nightmares on horseback came with him. He asked one of the natives he trades with about a symbol painted in blood on his barn that Silas and his men left behind. The trader told him that it was the mark of something ancient and evil, but he wouldn't say any more about it. We're headed to meet the trader's relative, who might say more about it. Like I said, Silas is going west, and if my tracking's right, he's headed for the town where this relative lives. Last night I desperately needed rest, and I know you did too after that hike you made to meet me, and that boozing. But we gotta pick up the pace now. After he rolls through one town, Silas waits a few days before hitting his next. We need to get there before he does. If I'm right about this, we can get some details on how he came back from the dead and stop him before he kills anyone else. I don't give a damn about the details, Wilson replied. I just want to see him dead again. You always had a one-track mind, Wilson. If we don't figure out what brought him back, what's keeping him from coming back after we kill him again? Wilson gave me one of those, "You're right," nods again. The day was hot, but we rode on. I was happy to catch up with an old friend. Just as the sun was sinking below the horizon, we saw the outlines of the town we were headed for off in the distance. We stopped, and Wilson squinted. He took a spyglass telescope from his saddlebag, pulled it open, and looked into the eye-hole. That's our town, all right. He handed me the telescope, and I saw the town. It looked similar to the one we'd just come from, only bigger and less dilapidated. A band of men on black horses was riding into it. Even from that distance I could tell they were evil. Silas was early, and we were late. I threw Wilson his telescope and took off on Winnie. She didn't need kicking or hollering like some horses. Winnie knows when it's time to go. Wilson fell in behind me. We heard gunshots and screams as we approached. Once we got close enough, I didn't waste any time. I fired on one of the riders in black. They were everywhere. Usually when a man gets shot, if he's still alive, he falls off his horse, screaming and hollering. This guy didn't fall. The scream he let out didn't sound human neither. It sounded like a dying vulture and a rabid howling wolf screaming together all at once. The rider's mouth was covered by a black bandana, but I could see his eyes as he turned to us and got off his horse. They were glowing green, like emeralds catching the sunlight, only the sun was setting, and there wasn't much light to be had. Another one popped out of nowhere beside Wilson with a knife that might as well have been a sword. He swung it at him. Wilson's big, but he's quick. He jumped sideways off his horse and rolled onto the ground. I stood up on my saddle and jumped toward the man with the blade. I tackled him to the ground as his blade flew out of his hands. Wilson fired another round at the guy I had already shot. Another otherworldly scream ripped out of his throat. The man I had pinned to the ground felt unnatural. It felt like there were 100 little critters squirming under his tattered black rags. The smell coming off him smelled like death. I pulled my pistol right up to his head and squeezed the trigger. He let out his own nightmare of a scream, and bugs started to leak from the hole in his head. Up to that point, I'd shot many men. None of them ever had bugs pour out of the bullet holes I made. Not even the dirtiest of the scoundrels. I got to my feet and watched as Wilson punched the head of the other rider clean off, and I don't mean that in a metaphorical sense. The man's head flew from his body when Wilson punched it. We watched as long, black, bug-like legs sprouted from his neck hole. He was still coming towards us, only now it looked like his neck was giving birth to a spider. "What the fuck?" Wilson shouted. Then he emptied his six-shooter into him. It didn't make a difference, though. The man kept coming. The spider crawled the rest of the way out, and the man's body, if that was what was under those rags, dropped to the ground. Before I could blink, that spider jumped right onto Wilson's face. He started screaming, and I pointed my gun at it. Pulling the trigger would have put a hole straight through Wilson's head, so I grabbed one of the legs and yanked it off of him. Before it could crawl off, I put a bullet through it and yanked several more of its legs off. Its body turned to ash and blew away. Wilson didn't even have time to thank me for saving his sorry ass before we saw a rider down the street pull a woman up by the back of her dress and into the air. He was looking to throw her. We took off and got to them right as he did. Wilson dove and caught her right before she slammed into the ground. The rider that threw her was taller than the others. He turned at me and a hiss came out of him that sounded like 100 desert snakes. I pointed to shoot, but before I could, a giant snake tail shot out of his black rags where his arm should have been and wrapped around my entire arm. The yellow eyes under the hood started glowing. The bandana covering his mouth fell away, and I got a look at the thing underneath. I wasn't surprised to see that he, or it rather, wasn't human. The thing had the face of a snake. Its mouth was open and I could see its huge fangs dripping with venom. Another scale-covered appendage shot out of the other sleeve and wrapped itself around my chest. I fired a few shots, but couldn't get a good one on the thing. My vision was starting to go black, but luckily, before it cracked my ribs and squeezed all the air out of me, Wilson threw a pitchfork at it. I don't know where he got the damn thing, and I don't much care. It flew right into the snake's mouth and through its head. Just like the spider, it turned to ash. Wilson yelled up at me from the street. "We're even now." I yelled back, "We'll figure the score when this is all over." I looked around and saw the riders all over that town. Some of them were running after people, and some of them were scaling up the walls of the wooden buildings. They were all straight out of a nightmare. Bugs, snakes, and bats taking on human forms. Unnatural things. My grandpappy told me a story with monsters like that once. But that was a story. The type of monsters Wilson and I were used to killing were human. We could hold our own against a few of the things, but there were too many of them for us to take them all on ourselves. I was trying to think of a plan, some kind of way we could take them all out. There were a lot of them, and they looked scary, but as far as I could tell, they could be killed. Get a clean shot with a bullet or a pitchfork in the right spot, and you'd have them turning into ash. My thinking was cut short, though, by a barrel getting hurled through a window behind me. Then a shotgun blast rang out from inside. One of the monsters flew through the hole where the window used to be, and I got a glimpse of him right before he turned into dust. I peeked my head through the window hole and saw a little old woman breathing heavily, shotgun in hand. She yelled out to me, "You one of 'em?" I yelled back, I'm human. Probably best you find somewhere to..." She cut me off. "Probably best you mind your own damn business." Then she cocked her shotgun. I'd be lying if I said that didn't put a smile on my face. Wilson, who had moved up next to me after the barrel went through the glass, said, "I think she can handle herself." Our respite from the madness unfolding around us was short-lived. One of the riders pulled up in front of us and screamed. Wilson mocked it and screamed back. We both took aim and fired at the thing. Wilson and I hit the thing clean in the head, dead shots. It flinched a little and then screamed again. I took off in one direction and Wilson took off in the other. I didn't get very far, though, because the creature lassoed my ankle just as I was getting off the house's patio. Man, did that lasso hurt. It felt like a ring of fire tied around my ankle. Before I really had time to take in the pain, though, that creature started dragging me through the dirt down the street. The left and right of me were blurs. I saw smoke and riders and guns blazing, and I heard screams both from the riders and from the ones they were hunting down. Suddenly, the rider who was pulling me stopped. But I kept sliding. I slid clear up to his horse. He was already off of it by the time I got to him and ready to stomp his boot down on my head. Just as he reared up to bring his boot down, I heard a gunshot ring out. The creature staggered, and I was released from the lasso's grip. There was a Navajo woman standing behind me. She looked down at me with a smoking shotgun in her hands. I couldn't help but notice her dark hair and eyes. She was beautiful. Wilson, who'd been running after me, fired a cylinder's worth of bullets into the thing, giving us a little extra time to collect ourselves. The woman who'd saved me opened a door to a nearby home and drugged me in. Wilson was right behind us. She slammed the door and said some words I didn't entirely understand. Then she lit 2 candles and 2 bunches of herbs that hung from the top of the door frame. We heard the creature outside pounding against the door. Then we saw it at the window, slamming against it too. With each slam, we saw a ripple on the glass, like a rock getting thrown into a pond. But the glass held strong. I yelled, "We gotta get back out there, this town needs our help." "Going back out there is not how you're going to help them," she replied. "It's how you get yourself killed before we can come up with some kind of plan." Wilson chimed in. "And what the hell kind of plan do you suggest?" He started pulling on the door. "Stop," she yelled. "We don't have much time. My ward won't last forever." Then it dawned on me who we were talking to. "Matina?" I asked. She looked at me with a mix of fear and anger in her eyes. "How do you know my name?" I replied calmly, hoping to cool her down. "I came from the last town those riders rolled through. They left a whole mess there, too. There was a symbol painted in blood on one of the barns there." Her expression softened a bit. She walked to a short table that sat in the middle of the room and pulled a pin from an inkwell. The symbol she drew and held up to me was what I'd seen painted on the barn. I reached into my inner coat pocket and pulled out one of the wanted posters of Silas. She closed her eyes and shook her head softly. "That's Silas's symbol, huh?" I asked. "No," she replied, opening her eyes. "That's the symbol of something very old and evil." I looked at Wilson, who looked more confused than I did. She went on. "Silas was only a baby when our tribe found him. He was left in a basket, and we took him in as one of our own. Our elders saw something great in him, and like me, he studied the ancient ways with them. For a time, Silas excelled at communing with the spirits that bind this world together and the realms beyond. But then he began to speak with dark forces, spirits that the elders forbade him to meet with. Another thing outside started banging on the window with the first creature, but Matena continued. He was angry with the world, angry with how he'd been cast aside and forgotten. He sought power from the dark forces. When the elders found out he was communing with them after several warnings, Matena held up the paper with the symbol on it again. They banished him from the tribe. Whispers of his misdeeds made it back to my people, and the elders could sense his spirit becoming one with the darkness. Each life he took fed his power. Then, one day, the elders informed us that he had passed beyond this realm, to death. His obsession with consuming lives and power was to be the end of him." "That's where you're wrong," Wilson blurted out. "Me and Quarry's obsession with hunting him down is what ended him." She looked from Wilson back at me and asked, "You two are responsible for separating his ties to the mortal world?" I nodded. "Yes, ma'am, but he had it coming, I can guarantee you that." "I have no doubt," she said. "But if the two of you are the ones who separated his tie from this plane in the first place, you can do it again." "That's the whole point of us coming out here, lady," Wilson barked. We heard more thuds from the other side of the door, and one of the creatures at the window sprouted a scorpion claw covered in tiny eyeballs from his neck hole. Mateno went on. "Before, Silas killed for power. He killed to consume it. After you killed him, his soul still had access to all of the power he'd been collecting. It was enough to bring himself back to this plane, and to control the natural world around him in sick and twisted ways. Hence the abominations lurking outside. He exists on this plane and the plane of the afterworld simultaneously now. He is pulling from the well of souls he's collected to create and control these creatures. Techniques he's learned from the ancient darkness. If we can separate his ties to this realm, we can stop him." I was thinking about one thing when she said that. Abigail. "And how do you propose we separate his ties?" Wilson asked. "I've been to the plane beyond this one," she said. "The afterworld. Since you two have severed his connection to this realm before, you must do it again. You'll have more power over him in the afterworld than anyone else would." "I signed up to kill Silas and save my family, not take a trip to hell and back," Wilson spat. "This is not hell," she said sternly. "This is the pool from which all life emerges, the water from which everything crawls. Silas has trapped many of the ones he's killed in this realm, and keeps their essence from being free. He draws on their pain and fear." Wilson took a swig from the small whiskey bottle he had stowed in his saddlebag earlier and asked, "This is where we get into some real trouble, ain't it?" I looked at Martina and said, "I'll do whatever it takes to kill him again." Martina looked into my eyes. She almost looked through me. I could see pain and grief on her face settled just beneath her beauty. Then she looked down at my shoulder. In the scramble of getting drugged through the street, I must have gotten hit by a stray bullet, 'cause my shoulder was covered in blood. You get shot enough times, like me, it kinda just starts feeling like bee stings. "You've been shot," she said. "I think it just grazed me. I don't feel a bullet lodged in there." "Either way, it needs to be disinfected." "I don't know if we have time for that." The creatures were really starting to pound on the door. There were more of them out there, and they sounded angrier than a pack of pinned-up wild dogs. Martina went to the window and made several more hand gestures while chanting. The whole house shook. It felt like a small earthquake. "That will give us a little more time," she said. "But we have to hurry." She went about patching me up with haste. Considering the ointments and tools she had, I was curious, so I asked, "Are you a doctor, or—" "Yes," she said. "When Silas was alive, the first time, he came back to our village. His anger over being banished drove him to do unspeakable things. He brought a band of men with him, and those who weren't killed fled. I was one of the lucky ones who survived. With my knowledge of plant medicines and healing, this town took me in as their doctor. This place became my new home. A few others from my tribe live here as well." She finished tying the gauze around my shoulder and wasted no time getting to an old chest that sat at the end of a bed. Martina produced 2 small pouches fashioned from leather and fur from the chest. "Within these are supreme tokens required for the offering, a hawk's skull and a rattlesnake fang anointed with the blood of past Deathwalkers." She handed them to me and Wilson. "I don't like the sound of Deathwalkers," Wilson said. "Pleasing the Deathwalkers is the only way to ensure safe passage into the underworld," Martina shouted. "This ceremony is typically done by the highest priest of our tribe." She looked down at the floor and then back up at us. "Since he has passed, I hold that authority. These grounds are holy. I heal and save others in this building. This ceremony will work." "You've done this before, right?" Wilson asked. "I've been a part of the ceremony. I've not led one, but I know what must be done." Wilson looked at me with skepticism, but there was no turning back. I lifted an eyebrow and gave him a nod. Martina spoke again as she continued to pull things out of the chest. "There are a few things you need to know about the afterworld. Time doesn't work the same way there as it does here. A lifetime there can pass, and it will only have been moments here. If you die in the afterworld, your soul will be bound there, and there will be no coming back." She laid a large bundle of herbs on the floor. "The afterworld is full of things that many do not understand, frightening things, but also peaceful, beautiful things." "How do we find Silas in there?" I asked. "He is not far from us in this world, and so he will not be far in the afterworld. You'll see him, and you will feel his presence pulling you toward him. He will be a swirling pool of pain and darkness." The sounds of Silas's monstrous forces clawing at the reinforced door echoed through the room. Martina's eyes narrowed. "If the Deathwalkers deem your offerings worthy and your souls pure, they will let you pass into their realm." I gripped the pouch tightly. The weight of the ritual's consequences settled in. This was our one opportunity to end Silas permanently, no matter what perils awaited on the other side. Martina moved to her fireplace, which had a small fire going already. She motioned for us to sit on the rug in front of it. We watched as she quickly placed bones, feathers, and sacred ceremonial objects around the rug. Then she threw the bundle of herbs onto the fire. It released a thick, pungent smoke into the air. Martina sat and began chanting in her tribe's ancient tongue. The guttural words reverberated all around us. She motioned for Wilson and me to present the hawk skull and rattlesnake fang talismans we had been given. Clutching them tightly, we held the objects up, allowing Martina's words to infuse them with power. The bones and feathers arranged on the ground started smoldering with what looked like spectral energies. Martina's voice got more intense. Each syllable felt like a dead weight pressing against us as she invoked the ancient right to part the veil between worlds. The smoke from the fireplace thickened and churned, taking on a life of its own as it coiled around us in hypnotic tendrils. Suddenly the hawk skull in my hand flared with blinding light. So did Wilson's rattlesnake fang. The chanting reached its peak, and Martina flung some sort of relic into the fireplace. All at once, the vapors congealed into a shimmering oval-shaped rift, lingering a few feet above the floor. The veil between realms had been torn asunder. Just beyond the rift's membrane, I could see the afterworld's glowing unearthliness stretching out to what looked like forever: trees, rivers, forests, and plains. "Go, now!" Martina's voice echoed all around us, already sounding distant and warped. "The path will not remain open for long." I locked eyes with Wilson. We had passed the point of no return. Taking a steady breath, I led the way through the rift. Then, as abruptly as we had crossed the veil's threshold, we fell and slammed into solid ground with bone-jarring force. I gasped for air, blinking against twilight stretching out in all directions. Honestly, I expected more of a magical type of entrance into the land of the dead. But we were in one piece, so I couldn't complain. Suddenly, the night air around us thickened with an unnatural mist that seemed to coalesce into vaguely human-like shapes. I tightened my grip on my revolver. The ghostly forms solidified into 3 towering Native American figures. Their eyes glowed with a pale, cold light. These were the Death Walkers. One of them extended a decaying, clawed hand toward us. Its voice slithered from ancient, cracked lips in a shriek-like rasp. "You have invoked the rite of transition and pulled us from the void between realms. No living soul may enter the afterworld without proving its worth." We had come too far to falter. In unison, we held up the sacred talismans for the Death Walkers to examine. The lead spirit's burning gaze seemed to stare through us, into our very souls, judging our intent. After what felt like an eternity, it spoke again. "Your offerings have been deemed worthy, and your souls, although tainted with death, may pass into this realm. Keep your offerings and use them to purify this realm and yourselves." With a gesture of their gnarled hands, the Deathwalkers fell into a liquid that flowed into a stream not far from us. Explaining what the afterworld was like is like explaining a dream. Not all of the pieces fit right. It felt real and looked real, but it shifted and warped. Wilson and I could see clear as day, but it was dark. We were outside in a forest with countless trees. The sky above us was splintered with lightning bolts that were frozen in place. There were hundreds of tiny tributaries flowing all around us that led to a stream just down a ridge in front of us. The Deathwalkers melted away into those waters. You could hear faint whispers mingle with the cold wind, and although it was cold, there was a warmth that I can't quite explain. I turned to look at Wilson. He was staring off in the distance, up into the sky. "I hate to be the one that keeps spotting things like this, Quarry, but I think that's where we're going to find Silas." He pointed towards a pillar of swirling black clouds in the distance. It stretched down from high above. The lightning that flickered in that funnel wasn't frozen. I gripped Wilson's shoulder and said, "Let's get going." There was another stream that those little veins of water were trickling into not far from us. We walked over to it and could see its glow. It had a greenish-blue hue. You couldn't see through it at all, though. It was like looking at the sky, just one flat color. The liquid ran through the trees around us. It shimmered off their trunks and leaves. I expected the afterworld to be a terrifying nightmare, full of creatures and abominations similar to the ones Silas had conjured up. But it wasn't. It was dark and held a presence meant to be respected, like a tiger in the jungle. It was wild and beautiful, but I could sense that at any moment it might lash out and bite. A ways off, the stream we were marveling at met up with a river. "Let's head up there," Wilson said. We followed the stream through the trees carefully. There were eyes in the darkness around us, and we could see figures shifting through it as well. Like I said, it was like a dream. Some things made sense. Other things really didn't. Wilson seemed uneasy, like a cat slinking by a doghouse. "You all right?" I asked. He whispered back, "We're trapped in the afterworld hunting down a man that we already killed once and almost got done in by some ancient afterlife guardians. How the hell do you think I'm doing, Quarry?" Something rustled in the trees. Wilson drew his pistol. We couldn't tell what it was, but we could see it darting back and forth, a white blur. He tried to follow it with his gun, but it was too fast. Then it stopped and walked out of the darkness. It was the spectral form of a man whose neck had been broken. I don't know if he was meaning to scare us or if he actually wanted to hurt us, but Wilson fired at him. Before we could blink, he was standing right in front of us. His glassy white eyes held no expression, and his mouth hung open, lifeless and broken. There was a noose dangling from his crooked neck. Wilson squinted and leaned in. "I know you. You're Levi the Strangler. I brought you in for a bounty a lifetime ago. They were paying quite a bit more to bring you in alive. Looks like you were the one that got strangled in the end, though." He started to chuckle. Levi, the Strangler, just stared at him. Another ghostly form appeared from the darkness between the trees. This time, I recognized the figure. No one could forget that face. Colt Cassidy. Shot up more towns than he could probably even count. More of the mangled, ghostly figures stepped out of the trees. It became pretty apparent pretty quick that Wilson and I were in deep shit. A pack of lunatic ghosts were staring us down like a pack of wolves staring down their kill. I yelled, "Run!" I half expected Wilson to try and shoot his way out of the mess, but when I looked back, he was right on my heels, and the pack of rabid ghosts were right on his. We made it to the river the stream was flowing toward. To my surprise, up ahead, there was a boat. It was a small, rickety thing, but it was floating, and it was potentially our means of escape. It was tied off on a nubby little stump. We weren't going to have time to untie it before those screeching ghosts swallowed us whole, so I pulled out my pistol and took aim at the rope. I wasn't sure if something like a pistol would work in the afterworld, or any weapon for that matter, but I had to try. I shot, but I missed. I heard a gun fire behind me and watched the rope snap. I looked back and saw Wilson tucking his pistol away as he ran. "Looks like you owe me one again," he shouted. The boat was rushing away with the current. We were getting close, but we were going to have to jump if we had any chance of making it. Ghostly white swirls were squirming from the mob of dead men, about to wrap themselves around us when we jumped. I had a feeling the weight of 2 grown men jumping off a ledge would have obliterated such a vessel. It almost capsized, but it held together somehow. I wasn't sure if it was the will of our good intentions or sturdy underworld oak, but it held. We got our balance and looked back at the pack of ghosts on the shoreline. They were staring at us, screaming out with guttural shrieks. "We should have seen that coming," Wilson began. "You don't make your way into the world of the dead and not expect to get met by the ones you done in the world of the living. Especially when the ones you done in are like those sacks of filth." Wilson was right. The people we killed were all bound to be in the afterlife. All the people Silas killed were bound to be there too. The river we were on got wider. It opened up and was rushing toward the spiral of clouds and lightning coming down from the sky. The white figures standing by the tree line behind us turned into specks as the boat floated on. Their screams faded, and all we could hear were the swirls of the water below in the black spiral we were approaching. We both watched in awe at the magnitude of the swirling pillar. Then, a blackbird landed on the front of our rickety, moss-covered boat. At that point, I expected it to talk to us or try and eat us, or try to run us off. But it didn't. Wilson saw it too, but he didn't pay it much attention. I could feel pain emanating from that bird. My reflection in its black eyes felt like it was sucking me in. I felt anguish, loss, and death. And just as I felt its darkness taking hold of me, it flew off toward the swirling pillar of clouds in front of us. A true death bird. As we drifted closer to the churning vortex of darkness, the air grew thicker with an oppressive dread. Flailing tendrils of black lashed out from the swirling funnel, as if sensing our presence. "You feel that, Quarry?" Wilson's voice was strained against the unnatural forces pressing in on us. "Like the whole realm is trying to smother out our spirits." I could indeed feel it. A psychic weight all over us, intensifying with each inch toward the vortex's center. This spiral, this vortex, was the nexus of Silas, anchoring to the afterworld. Ghostly shrieks echoed all around us as wispy forms began to emerge from the vortex itself. The souls Silas had stolen and drained over the years. "Don't let him overwhelm the boat," I shouted, drawing my revolver and firing shots through the apparitions. I knew it wasn't going to do any good, but instinct took over. Wilson swung an oar like a weapon, dispersing any spirits that got too close, but for each one brushed away, 3 more took their place, clawing at us. Some of the spirits were coming up from the waters, and some came down from the swirling clouds. Then a towering figure took form from the vortex's swirling evil energies. The hideously distorted face of Silas himself. His smoke-like skin flickered with agonizing faces trapped within, screaming silently for release. "Well, isn't this a morbid reunion?" The phantasm rumbled. His voice echoed through the afterworld with a disgusting cackle. "The fools who arrogantly tried stealing my immortal soul from me. We're here to finish what we started, you vengeful son of a bitch!" Wilson spat back defiantly. "And this time we're cutting those tethers for good." Silas's face contorted into a nightmarish sneer. "You mortals dare challenge the force I've mastered. Very well, I'll unmake you both here and now." With an unholy bellow, his essence surged outward in a shockwave of force. The wave slammed into our small boat, nearly tipping us into the roiling waters of anguished souls. I grabbed Wilson before he could tumble over the side. That's when I noticed the talisman around his neck, glowing. The one around my neck was glowing too. "The talismans!" I yelled over the deafening psychic pulse. Nodding feverishly, Wilson produced the rattlesnake fang amulet. I clutched my hawk skull talisman tightly, allowing its inner glow to blaze forth into a beam of purifying light. The beams lanced outward, spearing Silas's wretched spirit form. His chorus of damned voices rose in anguished disharmony as our talisman's holy power began to sear his anchoring tethers. But Silas was too powerful for this realm. His essence fragmented, then reconstituted anew like a regenerative virus. Appendages lashed out, aiming to strip the talismans from us. I hunkered down, pouring every ounce of spiritual fortitude into maintaining the hawk skull's beam. If we faltered for even an instant, Silas's darkness would have snuffed us out and trapped our souls for eternity. Then I felt a familiar warmth beside me, like a candle's flickering defiance against the gloom of Silas's vortex. It was Abigail. She was floating among the other trapped souls, reaching out to me. Then I looked over to Wilson. He was giving it everything he had. He was fighting for his family. It was all happening in what felt like slow motion. The darkness was closing in on us. Our talismans didn't hold enough power to sever Silas's tether. I realized what had to be done. I held the hawk skull up to my heart and pushed everything I had inside of me into it. Darkness was shooting from Silas's eyes and mouth and coming from all around him, but our light was fighting it. I felt myself leaving my body and getting sucked into the skull. Silas's waves of darkness were retreating. Wilson noticed what I was trying to do and screamed, "What the hell are you doing, Quarry?" My body went limp and collapsed on the boat. My life force, all of the energy inside of me, the pain, the grief, the hope. I shot everything at Silas. It flared like a supernova. The anguished faces inside of Silas's burned away. Their tormented screams transcended into sighs of sublime release. One by one, the souls he had tethered were slipping from his grasp, finding final peace. Silas's wail of frigid fury shook the afterworld's foundation as his last vile tethers were severed, his shadowy presence rapidly destabilized like a star collapsing into a lightless void. The boat flew away from Silas's demise. With a final reverberating roar of extinguished malice, the vortex imploded in a blinding light. Wilson shielded his eyes and regained his balance on our tiny boat. I was with Abigail, floating in the blue waters, in peace. She was more beautiful than I remembered. I felt her embrace, and as her long hair swirled around me, she spoke. "You can't stay here, Quarry." "Why not? You're free now, and nothing's left for me in the world of the living." I can't quite explain how, but I could hear Wilson pleading with my body in the boat above the waters. "You ain't dying, Quarry. Wake up, you sorry sack." Abigail continued. "You've much yet to do, and there's much healing to be done." Wilson shouted again. "God damn it, you son of a bitch, wake up!" He was smacking me and trying to do chest compressions. Where he learned that, I'll never guess. I spoke to Abigail again. I tried to heal. I tried to wipe the earth clean of every killer I could find. I didn't do the bounties for the money. I needed... You needed to heal," she said. "You still need to heal." She was silent for a moment, and I just held her. "Thank you, Quarry." Then we kissed. Disembodied, floating in that blue soul water. When I opened my eyes, she was gone. I felt myself rushing back to my body. Wilson's screams got louder and louder. Then I felt his fists pounding on my chest. My eyes shot open, and he stopped. There were tears in his eyes. He smiled and tried to wipe them away nonchalantly. He fumbled over his words. Oh, hell." We hugged. "Looks like the score's in my favor. You owe me two, Quarry." I looked at Wilson with a cross face and said, "I shot my whole damn soul at Silas. I think we're about even." Wilson nodded and smiled. We both laughed. Just then, the water under our boat began to bubble and churn. "Damn, we didn't take him out after all," Wilson shouted. The Deathwalkers emerged from the waters, slowly. I can't quite explain what I saw, seeing as we were in the dreamlike afterworld, but one of them took a dagger and sliced an opening into the air in front of us. Then he and the others proceeded to rip open a portal, literally out of thin air. Only reason I knew it was a portal was that it looked similar to the one we had come through the first time. Wilson couldn't paddle fast enough. As we crossed through, the Deathwalkers stared and nodded in approval at us. On the way in, it felt like we took a fall out of a tree. Not too hard of a landing and nothing too crazy. The way out was something else entirely. There were spinning lights all around us and echoing voices. I think I even heard Wilson let out a cry at some of the strange creatures and faces that flew by us. For a sec, I didn't think the tunnel was going to end. Then I saw a flickering flame up ahead. We were flying toward it, quick, and as we approached, more flames appeared. My instincts were telling me that flying into flames was not the best scenario, but the force of the afterworld tunnel kept hurling us toward them. Wilson was full-on screaming at that point. I was just bracing myself for impact. We tumbled into Matina's room through her fireplace. She rushed to us and began patting the flames out of our clothes. Wilson ran to the window and smiled. "Come here, look!" Bettina and me went to the window, and the three of us watched as the creatures outside turned into ash. They blew away in the breeze. "Hot damn!" Wilson shouted. I turned and smiled at Bettina. We didn't need to explain that we had defeated Silas and freed the souls he'd captured. After a day of helping the town sort things out and drinking whiskey, Wilson went back home to his ranch and his family. Last thing he said to me before he took off was, "Next time you need me to come help you fight some unholy bastard that came back from the dead, you know where to find me." And wouldn't you know it, Abigail was right. I still had a lot to live for, and I had a lot of healing to do too. I stayed with Bettina in that town. She taught me everything she knew about healing and helping. Eventually, we started a life together, and now we're teaching our kids how to heal others too. Sometimes, when I'm all alone, I see that bird, that death bird, and it reminds me of who I was and the things I was running from. I don't run from the darkness anymore. Now, I walk straight into the light. I had to do a Western. It's been on the list for a long time, and I really hope you enjoyed listening to it. I read a bunch of comics and graphic novels to get prepared for this one, Weird Westerns and Jonah Hex, and I read this series called Splatter Western that was really good. I also watched the movie Bone Tomahawk, and I've seen like a ton of Westerns in my life, but when I was looking for the fusion of Western and supernatural or horror, when I was looking for like those type of stories, it's kind of, there aren't a ton. There were way less than I thought there were going to be, so I consumed what I could, and I wanted to write a story that I would like to see or like to hear, and so I'm really happy with how it turned out, and I hope that you, and like I said, I hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to support the podcast, there are a plethora of ways you can do so, the first of which is leaving a rating or review on whatever podcast streaming service you're listening on. That really does go a very long way. Also, just telling your friends and family about the podcast goes a really long way as well. I also have a Patreon at patreon.com/strangewhispers. That link will be in the show notes. Over there you get early access to stories, and you also get some exclusive content that you're not going to get anywhere else. However you choose to support, I cannot thank you enough. Thank you for being here for this episode, my first exploration into the world of the Wild West. The next story is in a completely different genre entirely, so stick around for the next one. And until then, keep creating.